Today I'm in Charleston, South Carolina, and going to visit Fort Sumter. I took this tour, I think, in the third or fourth grade as part of a school trip when I lived in Columbia, South Carolina, about 2 hours away from Charleston. This is the first time I've been here in probably 10 years. If you don't know the history of this fort, this was a federal fort at the entrance to Charleston Harbor, which received the first shots of the Civil War fired from Fort Johnson, which had been taken over by the Confederate States of America, namely South Carolina, which was the first state to secede from the Union in 1860 because of their objection to slavery being ended in the North and again in the South. The North was mostly industrialized while the South was agriculturally based and strongly linked to slavery from African slaves that were sold into slavery in Africa and then transported to the United States, many of whom arrived at the United States through Charleston. There were a small number of very wealthy planters that had the vast majority of the slaves and really drove the economy. They were the oligarchs of South Carolina and the South in general. And many of these families are still in Charleston, some of which are still involved in political issues and political offices. And of course, I'm not going to show everything in the museum. It's not a very large museum, but it shows most of the important points regarding the history of Fort Sumter and the beginnings of the Civil War. The ferry boats run throughout the day. This was the last boat of the day, leaving at 2:30 p.m. The boat holds about 300 people, and it was full. Given that this was a Saturday, the Charleston Harbor was fairly busy, and I saw at least two groups of very small sailboats taking sailing lessons. We're arriving at the fort that really doesn't look very big, but recall this was under bombardment for over 30 hours with over 3,000 cannon shots. This used to be a 3-story high structure, now to really less than 1 story in most parts. This is much smaller as far as the size of the property than, say, Fort Jefferson, which is near Key West in Florida. Another interesting point of history is there were only around 75 or so people on the fort when the attacks began. They were under siege for about 2 or 3 months before the Confederate States actually launched their attack, and things were very polite before that. They even received mail service and food deliveries from Charleston. Many of the people that were on the fort were construction workers working on trying to complete the fort, which had already been under construction for 30 years by the time the Civil War started. And this black structure in the center of the parade ground is actually a more modern fort that was built after the Civil War ended. There's really not much left of the original walls, as you can see, and there are various cannons that were used to defend the fort. One of the park rangers is up below the flag giving some of the history lesson about Fort Sumter and the beginnings of the Civil War. They were also going to lower the flag for the last time of the day, since this was the last ferry tour of the day.
Unforgivable. Grievous act against their honor, those wealthy, powerful white men of South Carolina are going to come right here to downtown Charleston, and they're going to draft a declaration of secession. In that document, they'll state that a geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and all of the states north of that line have united in electing a man to the high office of President of the United States, whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. As a U.S. soldier in South Carolina,
During the 2 months Between secession of South Carolina from the Union and the beginning of hostilities of the Civil War, the Confederacy was building up forts that were surrounding Fort Sumter, including Fort Moultrie, which is across the entrance to the Charleston Harbor, and Fort Johnson, which was on the same side of the harbor as Fort Sumter, as well as Morris Island, the tip of which is just beyond the flagpole here. The federal government wanted to send soldiers and reinforcements and more supplies to Fort Sumter, but were concerned this would be an act of war. And during these first 2 months of the secession, there was still a lot of hope that war could be averted and that perhaps there could be a peaceful resolution to the secession of these states. Because of this, the Union or federal government was afraid to do anything that might offend the South during this time period, including sending reinforcements to the Fort Sumter crew. When the soldiers at Fort Sumter finally ran out of ammunition and were running out of food, they had agreed to surrender and evacuate the fort, but they managed to get the South to agree to a flag lowering ceremony. They were initially going to do a 100 cannon salute, but when they got to cannon 47, a couple of people died when one of the cannons exploded, so they cut this short to just 50 cannons. The original flag that was pulled down was later raised on April 15th, 1865, but you don't hear a lot about this in the history books because something else happened on that date in 1865. Namely, Abraham Lincoln took his wife to see a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. There's a pretty popular sandbar right next to the fort with about 20 boats and some people actually swimming in the water, which had to be pretty cold this day. This monument commemorates the people that were serving on Fort Sumter during the bombardment. As I mentioned before, there were only 100 less soldiers here, many of which were engineers and construction workers, and it even lists 6 or 8 people that were in the band. This fort was constructed, of course, to defend against enemy invaders from the ocean and not really to defend itself from other federal forts or from the state of South Carolina. So many of the cannons originally were pointed into the harbor. One can only imagine what it must have been like to be in here trying to defend the fort, knowing you were massively outnumbered and massively outgunned. And there were actually Union ships just outside the harbor waiting that dared not enter for fear of being trapped in sandbars. One wonders if this is actually the type of cannon that was used at this cannon hole, because the hole is so small, there's really no room to aim this thing. You can only move it, inches up or down to change the trajectory of the cannonballs being fired. Really hard to read this marble plaque that is next to the entrance to the fort, but this was mounted in 1929 to honor the Confederate soldiers that manned the fort under Union bombardment during the duration of the Civil War. Charleston Harbor was blockaded, and there were some blockade runners that got through, but for the most part, Charleston was under siege throughout the Civil War. I suspect a lot of this wall was repaired, as there's various different ages of brickwork, but again, remember the fort was under construction for 30 years prior to the onset of the Civil War, so it was probably a stop-and-go project, and the source of bricks may have changed over the years. So that wraps up the tour of Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. Worth a trip. It's about 2 hours total, 30 minutes each way on the ferry. and an hour at the fort. It's a lot smaller than, say, the Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine or Fort Jefferson near Key West, but it serves an important place of history, being the first place that was attacked by the Confederate States of America to begin the American Civil War, which extended from 1860 to 1865. See you next time.